I'm Hübner. I'm holding the Jean Chair for European Integration and Global Political Economy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in Canada. And in the last 2 to 3 years or so, I'm following the launch and then the ongoing negotiations about a comprehensive economic and trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. This is a very ambitious project. It started in times when both sides were, whether they spoke about it or not, pretty sure that the global trade negotiations in the so-called Doha round will not come to a successful end, and decided to go on a bilateral path. The agenda is ambitious. If the agreement will be signed, it will be more far-reaching, more deeper than the existing North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada, US and Mexico. So it's quite a step forward. However, negotiations haven't been settled yet. We are in a final phase. According to official statements, both sides are very optimistic to come to a conclusion end of 2012. This would mean that probably in spring 2013 the text will be ready to be signed off on both sides. In the European case, it has been passed by the European Parliament. So this may be a small hurdle, but still something we have to take into consideration. So even though when both sides, the governments of both sides or the representatives of the EU and the government of Canada are thinking they are ready to sign, it's still another hurdle on the European side. But from the European side, I think so this agreement is interesting. It's as I mentioned, ambitious, but it's not a big story. It's not for the EU. Canada is a relatively small player. So the question is then, why are they so eager? Why did they start this whole negotiation? And one answer to it is that it may be a kind of model agreement that may open up negotiations and the launch of a similar project with a much larger market than Canada is, namely with the US. So I think so even if CETA would be successfully signed and come into working, it's already opening a door to NAFTA for European companies and for all kind of economic actors on the European side. So even with CETA, so to say, the EU is out of a sudden in NAFTA. But I'm pretty sure it will be followed by a further agreement or launch of an agreement with the US. So where are we? Both sides have accomplished a lot already. We have to say this is in a 2-year time frame. It was, we can say, successful negotiations. Many people were skeptical, saying that they can't do this in such a short time period. But so far, they moved along nicely. But still, there are stumbling blocks for both sides. Only to mention, let us say, 2 or 3. For the Europeans, one of the most important items, given the fact that tariffs are already pretty low between Canada and the EU. Therefore, what could be the very important item? One item for the EU is procurement, public procurement, opening up public procurement markets. That's a very important element. This also would open up a lot of new market opportunities for European companies. The public procurement market in Canada, again, it's not by far not as big as US, but it's still a chunk of money where out of a sudden European competitors, companies could compete with Canadian and others for all this kind of building, schools, hospitals, all those kind of things, public transportation. There are a lot of opportunities. That's very important for the EU. A second element that is very important from the EU side, they made it pretty clear from the very beginning, is this only will happen if the provinces are on board. Because the federal government in Canada, they can sign a lot, but they don't have the actual political power to make provinces according to those agreements. So this was a kind of condition on the side of the EU. And indeed, it's the first time in Canadian history that international trade relations are not only done by the federal government, all those provinces are sitting on the table. They were sending delegations to the EU, and so it's a very interesting process. One byproduct, and this may be one of the motives on the side of the Harper government, is that This may lead, the first time also, to the creation of a common market in Canada. Unlike in the EU with 27 countries, Canada so far has no common markets. There are still hurdles, rules, regulations that prevent free trade inside Canada. Now with all the provinces on board with this agreement, they have to agree on a couple of things. And this may help even to liberalize the market relations between the various provinces in Canada. So for the Canadian side, again, the question is, why are they interested to do that? That's also not so easy to answer, actually. I'm sure it belongs to the free trade philosophy of the current government, but it has been started already under the Liberals, so it's not only a conservative project. If we look at the trade relations between Canada and the EU, Canada is actually running a trade deficit. So there will be losers in Canada. So one of the driving forces may be, from the Canadian side, that with an increase in competition, we will see more efficiencies, and it will be a element, a policy that may indeed drive more liberalization inside Canada. And this definitely is one of the targets of the Harper government. So those are the motives. If you look at a bigger picture, I already mentioned Doha round with WTO. I think so. This agreement would be the first one between two OECD countries, two of the G20 countries. So this may also be an incentive to either move towards many more bilateral agreements on a global level, or eventually to rethink the Doha process, to relaunch it, and to open up the door for truly multilateral negotiation, not only bilateral. From an economic point of view, this would be the best way to go. So in this respect, I would say CETA is a kind of second best strategy, but still it's relevant. It will change the landscape in Canada, not so much in Europe, as I mentioned, but it will be a kind of element, a policy that will change habits, it will change markets, it will change regulations in Canada. To give you only another example, one of the things they will probably have to compromise has to do with the agricultural sector. In Canada, we have supply management. This leads, for example, to this sad fact that for everybody who likes European cheeses, it's a luxury good in Canada. This has to do with the fact that they are restricting the quantity of cheese that is allowed to come from Europe. So with CETA, out of a sudden, we'll have many more French, Italian, and other cheeses available, and obviously a bit cheaper, because this is adding competition. But then on the other side, it adds a lot of pressure on dairy farmers in Canada. So you can see there's a give and take. And from a social perspective, I think so, we will see positive consumer rents. Means from a consumer perspective, some elements will be cheaper. The supply, the offer will be a higher kind of variety. So that's a good thing. But the other bad thing is we may have to see and observe job losses. So that's obviously something we have to deal with. And this also explains a part of the resistance, a part of the kind of critique, the kind of scare and fear on the side of trade unions of all kinds, private sector trade unions, but also public sector trade unions, who fear that with public procurement, some of those very efficient, competitive European companies will take away jobs and job opportunities. So it will be a very interesting time, but in terms of liberalization of trade, I think so that's still the way to go. And Canada and the EU would set the pace for many more agreements of this kind on the global level.